Good morning, club members. We digest world-class journalism and talk it through in plain English. Here are 5 stories worth your time. Ukraine has stopped its drone attacks on oil tankers near a major Russian port. American Vice President Vance personally asked Ukrainian leaders to pause the strikes. Vance called President Volodymyr Zelensky late last month to make the direct request. Washington feared the attacks were destabilizing world oil markets and harming American companies. The targeted Black Sea terminal handles crude oil piped across Russia from Kazakhstan. 2 major American energy companies, Chevron and ExxonMobil, hold large stakes there. Chevron owns half of the largest oil field feeding into the pipeline network. ExxonMobil also owns a 25% share in the same Kazakh operation. In fact, an oil tanker hired by ExxonMobil was hit during July strikes. The US administration views this Kazakh pipeline as a vital energy supply for Europe. Ukrainian drone strikes on the terminal had caused severe disruption throughout July. Daily oil shipments through the port dropped by 300,000 barrels. Shipping rates and insurance costs more than doubled as a result of the danger. Global oil markets were already under pressure from conflict in the Middle East. Kyiv agreed to halt the strikes on ships using the pipeline terminal. Ukrainian officials confirmed they set up special rules to follow the American request. They agreed not to target non-Russian vessels or pipeline infrastructure in the area. This concession was not just a friendly gesture to the White House. Ukraine accepted the deal to secure potential American support for Patriot missile systems. Kyiv desperately needs Patriot missiles to protect its cities from Russian airstrikes. Long-range drone attacks on oil facilities had been a key Ukrainian war strategy. Striking energy infrastructure was aimed at cutting off revenue funding the Kremlin. Ukraine had previously ignored American diplomatic warnings to stop hitting energy targets. However, the urgent need for air defense forced Ukrainian leaders to compromise. Vance has previously been a sharp critic of military aid to Ukraine. That history makes this bargaining over missile defense support particularly delicate. Ukraine now faces a tricky balance between damaging Russian profits and pleasing Washington. It remains uncertain whether this compromise will actually yield the requested Patriot missiles. For our second topic, we turn from oil tankers to international aviation. Singapore Airlines recently reported losses of nearly $800 million on Air India. That's a painful hit for an airline famous for its careful discipline. So why did a sensible investment turn into such a financial disaster so quickly? The story really began back in 2013. Singapore Airlines created a successful joint venture called Vistara with the Indian conglomerate Tata. Years later, Tata decided to buy back the national carrier Air India from the government. Singapore Airlines helped advise Tata during those privatization talks. Executives in Singapore saw a major opportunity for long-term growth. Their home island has a small population and no domestic flight routes. Meanwhile, millions of new travellers in India were taking to the skies every year. Singapore Airlines couldn't afford to miss out on that booming market. In late 2024, Singapore Airlines folded Vistara into Air India. In return, they took a 25% stake in the expanded business. Management knew the old state airline had aging planes and poor reliability. Fixing the carrier was always going to require years of heavy investment and patience. Yet almost immediately after the deal closed, a wave of bad luck struck. First, a catastrophic plane crash last year killed over 250 people. The tragedy forced Air India to ground jets and perform urgent safety inspections. Second, political conflict led Pakistan to close its airspace to Indian flights. Rerouting long flights around Pakistan caused severe disruption and cost $600 million. Third, a worldwide jet fuel crisis pushed fuel prices up for all airlines. Global supply chain delays also held back new aircraft deliveries and cabin upgrades. On top of that, the Indian rupee lost significant value against the dollar. All these problems hit Air India before its transformation could produce results. Just 5 months after signing the deal, Singapore Airlines had to inject more cash. Because it owns a quarter of the business, it must absorb those operating losses. Financial analysts now warn that Air India won't become profitable for several years. Any meaningful profit for Singapore Airlines is likely far down the road. Singapore Airlines wanted to secure a foothold in a giant aviation market. Instead, it's trapped funding an expensive turnaround during an exceptionally bad period. For our third story, we move from airline losses to a shock in the American housing market. One of America's biggest home lenders has just accepted a rescue package worth over $2 billion. The business is called United Wholesale Mortgage. It provides thousands of home loans across the country through independent mortgage brokers. Just last week, the owner, Matt Ishbia, released a cheerful video from his office basketball court. 3 days later, he admitted that his company had suffered a massive financial loss. So how did such a major lender run into trouble so fast? The problem started when Ishbia made a huge bet on falling interest rates. He expected central bankers to lower borrowing costs quickly. He set up complex investments to profit from that expected drop. Instead, interest rates remained high because home prices and inflation stayed elevated. That single bad trade lost $603 million in just a few months. Lenders often try to hedge or protect their business against market changes. In this case, the financial hedge failed and created a devastating bill. To stay afloat, the firm had to ask outside investors for help. A distress investment firm named Oaktree Capital is now supplying a $2.1 billion lifeline. Ishbia himself had to add $150 million from his personal fortune. In return, Oaktree has taken 2 seats on the company board of directors. They also took control over how the business manages its cash and dividend payments. For years, Ishbia collected hundreds of millions of dollars in dividends from his company shares. That steady income helped him buy the Phoenix Suns basketball team 3 years ago. He even pledged his shares as security for personal loans from major banks. Now, those regular dividend payments are completely stopped. Investors panicked, and the company's share price plunged by 30% in a week. The shares have now lost nearly 90% of their value since going public. The firm faces a tough market as high borrowing costs keep home buyers on the sidelines. Fewer people are buying houses, which reduces the demand for new mortgages. Ishbia insists that the core lending business has a bright long-term future. However, he no longer has complete freedom to run the business on his own. He must now answer to Wall Street lenders who hold ultimate control over his finances. After financial collapse, our fourth story turns to a quiet revolution inside a laboratory. Scientists have used artificial intelligence to design and build working viruses from scratch. These are not viruses that make people or animals sick. They are bacteriophages, tiny, natural predators that exclusively infect bacteria. For billions of years, phages have hunted bacteria across the planet. Today, they could play a key role in solving a medical crisis. Bacteria are constantly evolving to survive our strongest antibiotic drugs. Doctors are struggling to treat persistent infections in hospitals. Natural phages can destroy specific bacteria without harming human tissue. However, matching the right natural phage to a resistant infection is slow work. That is where generative biology steps in. Researchers trained advanced AI models on more than 2 million phage genomes. The software operates much like the systems behind modern chatbots. Instead of learning word patterns, it learns the language of genetic code. The team asked the computer to redesign a simple, well-known virus. This natural virus contains just 11 proteins and infects E. coli. The AI generated 285 completely new genetic blueprints. Scientists then synthesized these artificial DNA sequences inside the lab. Most of the AI proposals failed to produce any living virus. However, 16 of the synthetic genomes created fully functional phages. These artificial viruses successfully invaded E. coli and reproduced inside them. In fact, some used genetic combinations that natural evolution had never tried. The researchers then exposed the new phages to resistant bacteria. The bacteria initially defended themselves against the original natural virus. Yet, the synthetic phages quickly adapted and infected the resistant bacteria. The AI did not map out that final victory on its own. Instead, it created a wide variety of starting options for natural selection. That diversity gave evolution the raw material it needed to win the fight. This accomplishment remains a proof of principle rather than an immediate cure. Designing a simple virus in a lab is still far from creating human medicine. Complex diseases will require far more intricate genetic engineering. Regulators will also insist on rigorous safety tests before clinical trials begin. Still, the broader message for science is unmistakable. Machine learning can now write functional genetic code instead of just reading it. Biology is no longer just a subject we study in nature. It is becoming a software language we can actively write. After looking at synthetic viruses, we end today with a quiet revolution inside the brain. Could a single brain chemical change medicine the way weight loss drugs did? A few years ago, diabetes treatments transformed medicine by helping people lose weight. Those medicines work by mimicking a single hormone released in the gut. Now, pharmaceutical companies are betting on a brain messenger with similar potential. The chemical is called orexin, and it regulates our daily wakefulness. Scientists discovered this molecule nearly 3 decades ago in laboratory animals. They noticed that animals without orexin collapsed into sleep without warning. Humans with narcolepsy lack the very brain cells that produce this vital chemical. Orexin is produced by a tiny group of cells behind our eyes. Once released, it connects to specific receptors on neighboring brain cells. It acts like an orchestra conductor for our internal alertness systems. It keeps chemical messengers like dopamine working in harmony together. On August 5th, American regulators approved the very first orexin-stimulating drug. A Japanese pharmaceutical firm developed the treatment to help patients with narcolepsy. It gives the brain the boost it needs to stay awake during the day. Current treatments for sleep disorders bring in $3 billion each year. Financial analysts think orexin drugs could reach $16 billion by 2035. Major drug makers are spending billions of dollars to acquire promising orexin compounds. One global pharmaceutical giant recently paid nearly $8 billion for a biotech startup. Yet the excitement extends far beyond severe sleeping disorders. Orexin does not just keep us awake during the daytime. It also influences our attention, motivation, and feelings of reward. Researchers believe these new medicines might help people fighting severe depression. Future versions could also offer new choices for managing addiction or attention disorders. For over a decade, doctors only had drugs that blocked orexin. Those older pills intentionally turned off wakefulness to treat insomnia. The new generation of drugs does the exact opposite by turning the brain back on. Stimulating brain networks safely across millions of people remains a delicate task. We will soon see if orexin becomes the next major frontier in brain health. That brings us to the end of today's stories. Thank you for sharing your breakfast with me, and I will see you tomorrow morning.